want to have a little sidebar with you about voting. In particular, I want to look at the SAVE Act. It's something that's been discussed in recent months, and I think it's important for us to just let people know where this is located, where can you find in Congress, what this is all about, and what are some of the issues that people have with the SAVE Act. So I want you to go to www.congress.gov if you're wanting to know where to find the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, or the SAVE Act, if you want to know what that's all about. Now, it says on the page, this bill requires individuals to provide documentary proof of U.S. citizenship when registering to vote in federal elections. Specifically, the bill prohibits states from accepting and processing an application to register to vote in a federal election unless the applicant presents documentary proof of U.S. citizenship. This bill specifies what documents are considered acceptable proof of U.S. citizenship, such as identification that complies with the Real ID Act of 2005 that indicates U.S. citizenship. Now, there are some issues with the SAVE Act that people have raised because I think just from the very beginning, I think about women who make up about 51% of the U.S. population. And as we all know, many women, when they are married, they take on the name of their husband, and they may take on the name of their spouse. And I think it's important for us to consider, well, what happens if they change their name? I think about my wife who changed her last name from her maiden name to my last name, and the things that had to go into getting the Social Security change, Social Security card, I should say, getting that change and getting other documentation change on her driver's license, etc. Now, if you're only going to use what was on someone's birth certificate, right, obviously that's going to be a problem, because if you're married now, your name isn't going to match your birth certificate. Okay, we got to make sure that we continue to stress that. Very important to bring that up. Now, here are some things that we want to make sure that we don't lose sight of when we talk about U.S. citizens voting and being eligible to vote. Well, one thing we should remember is citizenship is already a requirement to vote. All right, is already a requirement. And there have been some arguments out there about how many eligible citizens don't have access. They don't have access to documentary proof of citizenship. Now, I would argue we need to resolve that. If you fall into that category, then the question becomes, what are you going to do to make sure that you have the proper documentation? I believe that everyone should have their birth certificate because you just never know when you may need it. Now, not only that, we have to ask the question, right? What are some unintended consequences that this Save America Act, or SAVE Act, however you want to look at it, what are some of those unintended consequences if we're not being mindful of the fact that some people may not have their birth certificate, some people may have changed their name once they got married, and if that's the case, do we want to disenfranchise eligible voters? I would hope not. But I think that there are some people that are okay with that, because there has been a lot of misinformation floating out there about elections and election fraud and election results. And the truth is that there has been very, very little evidence of any type of election fraud. Just the reality is it's just not there. It's really not. And instances of non-citizens voting is extremely rare, because people who aren't citizens, putting yourself in a position to be arrested for committing a crime, I don't see why people would willingly do that in large masses. Okay, now, if you're wondering about voting rights itself, I would again encourage you to go to the government websites, www.usa.gov, okay, and put in voting rights, and it'll bring up some voting rights laws and constitutional amendments. Those who may want to know what are some of the amendments that have been added to the Constitution that affects voting rights. So you have the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, the 24th Amendment, and the 26th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote in 1870. Okay, but many women weren't able to exercise this right at that time. The 19th Amendment, however, ratified in 1920, gave American women the right to vote. Okay, so we're talking about women having the right to vote barely over 100 years old. The 24th Amendment was ratified in 1964, which eliminated poll taxes. And this had been used in some states to keep African Americans from voting in federal elections. And the 26th Amendment that was ratified in 1971 lowered the voting age for all elections to 18. So some of these amendments that we're talking about, when we think about the U.S. Constitution, these amendments are not very old. I mean, you're talking about the 24th and 26th Amendment are not even barely, I think one's 60 years old, a little over 60 years old, and the other one's not even 60 years old yet. So these amendments, which are extremely important, they are not that old. And we have to keep in mind that there has been a lot of federal voting right laws that have been passed when we think about the Civil Rights Act of 1870 and Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960 and 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has obviously been brought to the forefront in recent months, in recent memory, because voting is extremely important, and there has always been a push to make it difficult for certain groups to be able to vote. It's just reality. If that wasn't the case, you don't need to continue to have the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act. Why do you need, as I mentioned previously, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 if everything was good following the 14th, 15th Amendments and all of those things to the U.S. Constitution? Why would you need another piece of legislation unless there has been some nefarious activity taking place historically in the United States when it comes to voting? Now, we say all of these things because this SAVE Act or this Save America Act, whoever you want to talk to about it, this idea that we need to have proof of U.S. citizenship when registering to vote in federal elections, and it sounds like it's the right thing to do on its face, but obviously there is some other things at play, because why do you need to have this in place when we already have laws on the books that address the issue about who can vote? That's the thing that I want you to think about as we continue to move forward and push toward the midterm elections in November. Why is there such a push to try to do something when it comes to who can and can't vote for these upcoming elections? When we start talking about voter fraud and things of that nature, when people put those out there, that type of misinformation, when there is little to no evidence of massive voter fraud, there is a reason why there are things being thrown out there, which I would call it lying, when people are just flat out lying about what's happening with our elections. They're trying to erode trust in the public's trust in our system. The reality is this: if there was voter fraud and there was these accusations out there that, say, for example, the Democrats are cheating, let's say that's an allegation that comes forward, as I mentioned in episode 8, if that's really the case, then how is it that the U.S. House is actually led by Republicans and the U.S. Senate is led by Republicans and the President of the United States is a Republican? If the Democrats are cheating, then why would they cheat only to the point of actually being in the minority? I mean, if you're going to cheat, you should cheat to be in the majority, and then you would have the power to enact some laws and do something about things that you do or do like or want to change. But obviously, if they are not in the majority, it is highly likely that they're not cheating, because usually you cheat to win, you don't cheat to lose. But that is a conversation for another day. This is just a sidebar, so just a little food for thought as we move forward and consider, what should we know about our voting rights? Where can we find information about it? I encourage you to go back and look at what things are already out there on our government sites as it pertains to voting.